My name's Steve Crocker. I was part of the early days of the ARPANET and have remained heavily involved in aspects of the internet from them. A couple of nights ago, Jake Feinler was inducted into the Computer History Museum as a fellow for her early work and lifelong work. The work that she and her group did, which generated the WHOIS system, among other things, leads directly into the existence of ICANN today. So I thought it would be appropriate to take the opportunity to probe back at that time and gather impressions. And here we are.
I'm Elizabeth Jake Feinler. Everybody wants to know about the Jake. My sister hung it on me when I was born because she couldn't say my name right. So that settles that problem. I joined the internet work by joining Doug Engelbart's group in 1972. I was already at SRI, and there were people up there running little things around on a desk and staring at television sets and wearing Birkenstocks and jeans, and nobody did that in those days. And so I thought they looked interesting. And so one day I asked Doug to hire me. So the first thing we did was a resource handbook. In those days, they thought the network was going to be a resource sharing network, sharing big computers, because you had to go there and get a time on the computer, and that was very time consuming. So if you had a network, you wouldn't have to do that. Lots of interesting people working there. And I felt like Alice through the looking glass. It was like I was in a different world. Anyway, and then in 74, I believe, I became the principal investigator, and I was that for 17 years, I think, something like that. Anyway, so then we were on our own, and there was a big funding hiatus. So the first year we had only one person and myself, 1.5 people. Johanna Landsberg was borrowed from the library. And then, and when we left the network, or I left the network in '89, we were an $11 million project, which was pretty interesting for women in those days. And I had a lot of good women to help me out.
I'm Mary Stahl, and I started working at SRI in 1978. And I was just a lowly research assistant at the time for a couple of years, doing things like editing documents and sending out big books, resource handbooks, right? Remember having a sore
And the
hand from
ARPANET director.
Remember having a sore hand from using a stapler to staple the bags together and send them. But in about '81, Jake decided that I should be a hostmaster. And so I took over the host table maintenance from Jake. And it was very manual, no automated stuff. It was all very manual, a lot of labor-intensive work on that. And labored away at that for quite a while. And probably, several years later, I had some assistants. Stu Romano was one. And a couple of other people who were the interpreters for Ken. They all became data input people as well as interpreters. So on January 31st in 1983, DCA decreed that we were going to be switching over from MCP to TCP. And so on that day, on New Year's Eve, I went into SRI, which had been closed for the week between Christmas and New Year's, because that's what a lot of businesses did. And it was freezing cold in there. So I and a bunch of other NIC people were in there. And at midnight, I had to install a new host table. And so for a while, though, there were dual host tables. There was the old one and the new one. I had to maintain them both for quite a while.
Well, I got a memo from DCA saying you will switch over to TCP/IP on what was it? January 1,
December 31st, yeah.
1983. And I went, oh, crap. I had to send these memos out to the whole world. And I said, all of these people that are going to do this are at universities or research institutes. They're not going to be open on January the 1st. And everybody came back. It was that was one of the technical miracles, I think, of the internet. Well, these two might say something about, we ran both tables for a long time. We cut over to the domain naming system on the DARPA side, or on the research side, I would say. But the military side hadn't made up their mind. There was the big protocol wars were going on then, and there was all this stuff coming from Europe, and they weren't sure which way they were going to go, and they would not decide to cut over to the domain naming system.
And Jake, I don't know if you remember this, but I came to SRI and you interviewed me to be your admin, actually. And again, I want to thank you because you said to me, oh, I think we could do something else with you. I was like, okay. And so I joined the Network Information Center. And at first, we issued what we call TAC access cards for the people on the military side. And I also was at the desk, the information center desk. And then I don't remember how, Mary, but somehow I was, I got to under Mary's arm in tutelage, and she taught me about the host table and how to do it. And maybe you were burned out at that time. I don't know. I don't know how many hosts were on at that time. I can't remember the number. But so eventually I was doing the host table, and I didn't realize, I can remember like, oh my God, this is a big thing. All these computers talking to each other. I just had no idea what I got into. Anyway, but I'm glad I did.
At first, it was kind of manual, but we did have a database that Ken developed, Void, or Void database. And we would keep the name of the host, the contact, the host number, two different kind of contacts, what kind of protocols they ran, and things like that. So there was all these things that were contained in this database, which is also the Whois database. Void was the system behind it.
Two questions that are relevant today. Were there any issues about the accuracy of that information and completeness? And was there any issue about who could see that information?
Every month, we would send out the tables and ask for feedback and corrections. So there was in addition to the host table, there was a table, sort of a file of contact information that got sent out every month. And it had to be, people who had changes had to report back to let us know. Otherwise, their information would be wrong in the database.
So before that,
Nick had this program.
Nick had a program called the Nick Query.
The Nick
So at the Nick,
ran
it ran a system.
service called Query.
There was a service called
Query.
Query that you could
Ask
connect to the
queries.
Nick and you can ask it queries.
Which
And that
later
was the start of what much later became Whois.
It was based on.
And it was based on the
structure.
the tree structure.
Well, I can start with the contracting problems we had because John was at SRI. And like I said, there were 30 hosts on the net, more or less, when I joined. And there was, I think, one assigned number. And I didn't even know what an assigned number was. And John was a programmer, and he said, I have this one assigned number. What do you want? I'll just maintain these. And that was fine. And he maintained, he and I don't know, somebody else at SRI were maintaining assigned numbers. We were doing the host table at the NIC. Well, then John went to ISI, and his contract there was DARPA. Mine was DCA. They weren't exactly buddies in the way they wanted to do things. And so that got to be a real problem. And I finally put John on our contract anyway, he was on our contract, and DCA would say, why is John Costello on our contract? He's a DARPA guy, you know. And then the DARPA guys would say, why is John on your contract? He's a DARPA guy. And so John and I and Joyce and all of the guys that were on doing naming and addressing all kept together. I was sometimes on the phone with John once a day, or, you know, whenever something would come up whose name it was. And if we hadn't done that, it probably would have been a big mess.
But they were also
There's the protocol numbers.
there were also protocol numbers
Assigned port numbers.
and assigned port
Everything
numbers,
you do.
everything that you
Keep
needed
things
to keep things working and running. It wasn't just a host.
Yeah, we only had the hosts on the host table, but the assigned numbers controlled a lot of things that were
Yes, yes.
programmable things.
It's basically a separate table.
Yeah.
So I actually know a little tiny bit about this, and I'm just trying to make sure I understood the right pieces. So as you've said, each network had a number. So the internet's a network of networks, so each network had a number, and those today are referred to as ASNs, assigned number, and those are handed out by the regional internet registries that hand out the IP addresses and managed through that. Separately, there's port numbers, and there are indeed protocol numbers and registries associated with both of those, and those were packaged up and managed, continue to be managed by IANA, and separate from the management of the IP addresses and the ASNs, all of which emerged out of necessity from as the network grew, and the management of those were done first by all of you, and then as it became unwieldy, broken off and passed out, and then became harder to manage. How was the decision made for the original 7 top-level domains?
That's a good
I
question.
think that points to you, Jake.
Well, and Ken, well, it turned out I was getting calls all over. Well, they announced they were going to go over to the domain naming system because the host table was really huge at that point and very unwieldy, and it needed a different
By
design.
huge, you mean like 2,000 hosts, because this is when I came in. So huge is relative.
Yeah, well, and then getting
Exactly.
bigger by the minute. And so I kept getting calls, and, like somebody, I think I got a call from IBM. I want a top level domain. I got a call from Jeff Goodfellow, kid hacker, that wanted a top level domain. And I thought, boy, this is going to be a nightmare. So it just seemed like there were groups at that time on the network. And so we just picked names for the groups that we saw that were out there. And I thought it would last about 6 weeks. It's still in place today. So, but it was Ken that came up with .com. We had a meeting, I remember.
Came up with,
Actually, I came up with most of them.
came up with most of the
Yeah,
names.
I came up with most of those names. For example,
Took them. Ran
and then
with-
you took them and ran with them
Actually made it happen.
and actually made it all
I
happen.
remember the meeting.
And I
we
remember
had
the
at
meeting we
December.
had at SRI.
The
There was a lot of
island
debate,
in the suggested way.
and not all of the names I suggested were accepted. I wanted to have .I for individual names,
I'm
but
sorry.
that was solidly rejected.
Post, yeah.
Postal, as you said before, was very very keen on starting with country names.
Global internet.
You know, he saw it as a global internet, and I thought,
Very good.
yes,
Yes,
I would
should have
agree,
that.
that we should have that. But then I thought to myself, how long is that going to take before all of the countries figure out what is this internet thing? What is this network thing? But now it's there.
But also in those days too, I mean, it was the control of the names themselves within the domains that it wasn't open to anybody where you could just go to a registrar and get a name. You had to have the actual, well, what was considered a legitimate reason for. So for example, edu, you had to be
Actually, you couldn't even be a lower school. You had to be a higher education in order to be in edu, and we wouldn't accept registrations from just anybody. Same for comm. You had to have a commercial presence, and so all of them actually had rules. Each top level domain had different rules, and we were the gatekeepers for those rules. And that was sort of a complicated thing because people wanted to be in a certain domain, and we were bound by our government contract, to maintain.
Didn't
those
you have
rules.
like a form too, like for the domain names that people had to fill them out? And there was a protocol, like you just said,
Yeah.
Vivian.
And the thing was, I think John had this view that the geographic domain, so under .us, he would build out this whole separate infrastructure that was more available to just business owners to have a local domain. And unfortunately, he did pass away before that came to pass, because I think if he had been around, we could be looking at a very different structure than we are today. I think the original top level domains, the view of it was good, but it didn't quite correspond to, say, how actual businesses worked. I can remember arguments with a business. The idea was you would be business.com. And then if you had a subsidiary, that business.com would take care of that because that was the hierarchy. Well, the business up here, may not within that company have anything to do with the subsidiary. So the subsidiary wanted to be up here. Well, that was against the rules. So there was a lot of arguments about that. It was just, it didn't quite map to reality, even though the theory of it was very good. Like you said, with the educational institution, why would one be K-12 and not be able to be an EDU, that kind of thing.
After I left the internet work, I went over to NASA Internet, NSI, and helped them. Their NIC was on DECnet, so you could only talk to it if you were on DECnet. So we brought it on the internet, then everybody could talk to it. And then we did some work on how to write websites, because everybody was just discovering the web. And it turned out that anybody could go up and write something about the web. It may not have anything to do with the agency that you were involved with. And so people were writing things all over about it, since they thought it was fun to put something on the web.
So I was at SRI until I think about 1993, at which time I quickly followed Jake to NASA to work at the NASA Science Internet along with Mary. Yes. She left that out. So we started the Network Application and Information Center at NASA started to give training in how to use the web, this really interesting thing. It was the early video conferencing time. And our group was the group that put up the first web page for NASA Ames. It was the NASA Ames webpage, which we felt we were entitled to do because we were the NASA Science Internet Information Center. So I was at NASA until 99, I guess. And then I went to work at a company called Nominum, which again was quite involved in domain name services infrastructure. And again, a lot of overlap there. Vivian and Mary were also there. So you can see it's one of those things where basically once you're together, you can't get rid of us.
You might notice that I'm signing and the voice is coming from my interpreter. I was born hearing, but I became deaf at age 5 and have been completely deaf since then.
That's really bad.
And that's relevant because,
I took classes.
well, when I went to class, I never understood the professor, so I just had to read books all the time, and I went to the library a lot. And it worked well enough that I got into MIT, and while I was there,
Another one.
I met another woman who was in charge of a competing group who said, you have to go to the AI lab. And there are more fun things to do there. So I went over there to the AI lab at MIT, and wow, hooked up to the ARPANET at that time. I was amazed and found that you could communicate instead of trying to read lips or writing by hand. At that time, I actually didn't know any sign language. And so the internet, wow, that was my way to communicate.
I might say something. There were night people and day people. The computers were so crowded and the users wanted to be on during the day. So the night people were mostly the programmers and people were designing anyway. So one of the night people was Ken. So that's how I got to know Ken. And then I asked Doug if he would. I didn't have a program. I had to go around to all the Doug programmers and ask them to fix something. And that was not working very well. And so I asked Doug if I could hire Ken, and he said yes, and that's how Ken got to SRI.
So at that time, I was ready to graduate
I forgot.
and was offered a job.
Yes.
Perfect timing and a perfect place for me to be.
Good.
I didn't know it at the time yet, but in retrospect, and I've worked in other companies as well, Jake was the perfect boss for me.
Very,
Very, very supportive and understanding.
one of the things.
And one of the things that she did that I realize now was so amazing. She arranged for the Nick to hire, when they hire new people, they try to find people who already knew sign language. So we would have interpreters on staff, and one of them is actually here.
I started at the NIC in 1985. I was one of Ken's interpreters, not the first one, not the last one, as he alluded to. I know that when I started, there were about 2,000 hosts on the internet because we counted them one time for future reference. So that's always an interesting tidbit. I can't beat Jake's 30, but it's still pretty early. So I started as an interpreter, which was a really interesting position because Ken was key to so many things that the interpreter got to sit in and all this interesting stuff. And I learned a lot. I'll tell you one thing that surprised me. I got email from my mother after so many years of kind of being, like Ken said, in this sort of community where these people know the internet and everyone on the internet knows people on the internet. All of a sudden I'm sitting at NASA and in my inbox comes an email from my mother. My mother is in the other world. That is not the internet world, right? And today the internet is the world, right? And that to me was that turning point where it wasn't just kind of my thing I did at work and kind of, a little esoteric. It was like, okay, now the internet is just there. It's there everywhere. It's ubiquitous. That I have to say surprised me. Thanks to my mother.
For me, when somebody's asked me what I did, and I said, I bring up this word host table, and they haven't a clue, and they have to describe it, and they're like, I think they just think the internet happened, somehow.
Yeah.
But no, there were protocols, and there were naming protocols, and there were these numbers, and just to, so it came from this very, a little more organized to it's just everywhere now, and the expansion is unbelievable, and I never thought it would go that far.